Hello and welcome to this episode of ThePrint Mind Over Matter. We've all experienced loss in some form or the other. चाहे वो loss relationship में हो, चाहे वो loss in terms of actual death हो, चाहे वो loss of a job हो, क्योंकि we do keep hearing a lot of news about people being laid off all of a sudden without any kind of warning. So how do we deal with grief and how does it affect our mental wellness? So this is what today's topic is. So here I have with me Hiba Siddiqui, who's a psycho-oncologist at Max Healthcare, and she's going to tell us more about grief and mental wellness. Hi, welcome to the show, Hiba.
Thank you, Tina, for inviting.
So let's start with basically how would we define grief and let's say its relationship to, mental wellness. As a psychologist, what does that look like?
Right. I think when we look at grief, we're looking at it as a natural response to loss.
Okay.
So it's also an emotional suffering that's caused when something or someone you deeply love or care about is sort of taken away from you or is not there. And grief comes in a lot of components where the more intense or significant the loss is, the grief will be equally significant. So we need to understand it in various contexts. We often look at grief as something that happens only when you lose someone to death. There are multiple angles of grief. You can grieve something where you're grieving a part of yourself because time lapse has happened and you haven't done so many vacations that you had to do. You can grieve losing a pet. You can grieve a relationship. You can feel the loss of relocating to another city and you miss home. So grief, when we look at it from the perspective, we need to also understand it while also broadening our own horizons and our own perspective of what that definition is.
Okay. So often there is this pressure to grieve in a particular way, to grieve in a certain period of time. So could you tell us more about that? Like, is there a healthy way or is there a healthy timeline to grieving?
Yeah. So first of all, grief doesn't come with a timeline.
Right.
And what we need to also understand is that it needs to be looked at in a very subjective aspect regarding the individual that is experiencing that. So my grief will be very different than yours. And we can't quantify it. We can't say that both of us are feeling the exact same thing because we won't. So when we look at a timeline, sometimes we don't have any. Sometimes we are grieving a loss for our entire lives. Sometimes the loss may happen in a very delayed manner. So in terms of how that particular feeling and that particular loss or pain or sadness or even the entire process of grief impacts your daily functioning, your day-to-day patterns of just well-being, is how we determine whether it's healthy or unhealthy or functional or dysfunctional. That your existing coping mechanisms or the ways you deal with the experience that you're going through, how exactly is it translating into your day-to-day routines? Are you able to resume functionality in the way you did? Or is it impacting your mood? Is it impacting your relationships? Is it impacting your own sense of being and well-being overall? Is it impacting your physical health as a result of, say, loss of appetite, loss of sleep, constantly having panic-like situations? You don't know how those also impact your own body and mind.
Okay. So are there types of grief as well? Because often there is a tendency that we feel that the category of, as I'm taking the example you said that losing a pet will be very different from, let's say, losing a parent, or it'll be very different from loss of a job, right? So I would see those as very different parameters, and sometimes I may even put it as more significant and less significant,
Absolutely.
right? So are there types of griefs?
There are many kinds of grief.
Okay.
I'll mention a few. So for example, you have something that we call anticipatory grief.
Okay.
Right, which may happen, say I work with a lot of, I work with oncology, right? So a lot of times when we have a diagnosis which is terminal, so when we're telling the patient or the family, they understand that I may have, say, 2 months more as per my prognosis. So the families may start preparing themselves that there is an impending grief that's expected, but it's not today. Sometimes you know that your pet, for example, is not well and you may have to put them to sleep. You understand that it could be a date that you decide. So feelings of a grief, which is feeling of an experience of grief that's anticipated, can also start the whirlwind of emotions that happen before the actual grief event has happened. Sometimes the grief can be very masked. So you may have experienced grief, but you don't realize you're actually experiencing symptoms of grief or loss until it starts impacting your work, your relationships, your own well-being, like I said before. Sometimes the grief is very chronic. You're constantly feeling those heavy feelings, the loss of that person, the place, whatever the grief might be, for a very long period of time. Sometimes the grief is very traumatic. It may be due to an accident. It may be due to a natural calamity. It could be riots, it could be fights and things like that. And then you realize that you're also having survivor's guilt because you went through an experience where you survived but somebody else didn't. Sometimes there's secondary grief, which you're experiencing through someone, right? Among many others. And so in our DSM-5-TR, they've given a name to a disorder called prolonged grief disorder, where it's also mentioned by the American Psychiatric Association, where you talk about how there are symptoms which are very exaggerated when you lose, say, someone to death. You also feel a part of you has been lost. You're constantly denying talking about that loss. You're avoiding active memories of, say, the person or the place. And it starts impacting with heightened emotions. You know, you might have anger outbursts. You might be very, very agitated. It might impact your own physical, mental health and well-being. Sometimes you choose to be isolated and very detached. There's a lot of emotional numbing that sometimes happens. And so we need to also understand that how it's impacting in terms of the kind of grief that you've gone through. Depending on, like I said before, the more significant the loss, the more the attachment pattern is to that particular event, the more intense the grief would be for you.
Okay. Often, because we've discussed it, there are types of grief. I feel like there's also a sense of guilt sometimes about grieving about certain things. For example, I may feel like, okay, you know, I have just lost a job, but somebody doesn't have, you know, food to eat 10 days a month, let's say. So what am I being sad about? I should not be sad about something. I remember this particular incident when my friend, you know, she was dating somebody and it had ended and she was sad, and then, you know, whatever, a few weeks later she went out with somebody and that didn't work either. So like, in her head, let's say in a span of 5 months, there are two people. How can I be grieving? Like what kind of person does that make me? There was a sense of judgment that I could sort of get from her. So I was wondering about the guilt of grieving, because I feel like we categorize, like I said, that sometimes we tend to categorize it. Sometimes, obviously, that categorization also comes from what we see around us, maybe in, you know, even in popular culture, or what we've been told while growing up, that itne time mein you should be, or who grieves over a breakup. Like we do hear these kind of things. So I was wondering about the guilt that often comes in.
All right. So yes, you feel guilty. A lot of times people feel guilty for grieving something that has surpassed the societal ideas of how much and how long you should grieve, right? So we live in a society which is collectivist right now. And we also live in a society that tells you to stop grieving and in a snap move on. Now, who defines that? For you or me? For me, my loss may have been more significant because it creates a hollowness in my life. For you, maybe it creates a different kind of hollowness. When we start comparing, and those comparisons of my pain is stronger than yours, my trauma is bigger than yours, my loss is so much more impactful than yours, what are you grieving? Whether it's death, it's due to death, it's due to a breakup, it's due to a relationship. The moment comparisons come in, the person who's grieving and who's trying to deal with their own emotions starts belittling their pain. That's when guilt occurs. For example, someone who's been in a relationship for 5 months has a breakup and somebody who's been in a relationship for 5 years ends up having a breakup, the person may end up saying, oh, why are you grieving a 5-month relationship loss, whereas mine was far more significant because it was 5 years. Now maybe the attachment patterns, the intensity of those relationships were very different. How do you define that? Someone who's dealing with, say, divorce, maybe they have lost a huge sense of self. They have probably had to cut down on their social circle to avoid uncomfortable questions. That's loss. But when you're guilty of not following in the footsteps of what society defines for us, should be a mourning or a bereavement period, that's when a lot of people end up feeling guilt. And we need to start normalizing it, that everyone's subjective experience of that pain, that loss, that suffering even, can also be to each their own, right? And I think that's where very commonly we find feelings that, oh, but someone's dealt with death, why am I grieving the loss of a pet? It was just a pet, right? But maybe that was their life, that was their routine. They were living alone, but the pet was all the joy that brought in their life, a relationship that added a lot of value and meaning. So you don't know how and with what privilege the person on the other side may end up making the person feel. And so people end up going back in their shell and start feeling like maybe I'm just making it a bigger deal than what it is.
We all sometimes tend to suppress our feelings and emotions, right? Sometimes it's because we don't have the time. Let's say I got a call in the middle of work, I have another hour to go, and I'll be like, fine, an hour later I'll think of it. Sometimes it's years, decades that we kept suppressing something because maybe we never felt ready to deal with it. So I was wondering what happens when we suppress the grieving that we probably should have gone through, and how does that impact our mental wellness?
That's a very interesting question, and very relevant to a lot of people who don't even realize that something they have experienced can also be, right now what they're experiencing can be an impact of grief, right? So grief, one, like I said before, doesn't have a timeline, but triggers can happen as unexpectedly as anything that probably happens in life. I might be having a very regular evening walk and I might see a parent and child, and it might remind me of a loss of, say, a parent. Or I see a couple, or these, very pop culture or Valentine's Day and things like that, which are very significant moments which might remind you of a moment you shared with your partner. So when we suppress our suffering or our pain, it starts bottling up the emotions that actually really badly want to come out. It could be that I'm closing myself so much from people, my friends, because I don't want unsolicited advice. I don't want 5 people to tell me what I should do and move on, get over it. I've heard that. I've read it. Social media is filled with a lot of pop psychology, right? I don't need to go to a therapist to deal with that. And I think we're all guilty of...
For sure. It's like as guilty as we are of Googling symptoms.
Absolutely. So when we suppress it, a lot of times we isolate ourselves, which leads to a lot of loneliness. We start detaching ourselves from people who might add value to my life or are significant to me. Why? Because we also fear attaching to them because, oh, they will also go one day. So the anticipatory grief sometimes induces a fear, a very, very heightened fear of loss. We might feel experiences of emotional numbing. We might sometimes project our own difficult emotions onto the other person who we might feel we can. It might lead to bullying. It might, even adults do it, right? We all know that. Sometimes it might just be, I'm in a bad mood, don't talk to me. So I create this very invisible wall around me that you're not welcome. What it does is that it makes me wallow in my pain all alone. Sometimes leads to self-pity, self-victimization. When those emotions don't come out, we also don't know that we're dealing with it in a very, very unhealthy way. We don't know in what year of our life it might come out. It might come out as a full-blown reaction. It might impact me even in a short or a long-term level on my physical health. Sometimes chronic illnesses, chronic psychiatric disorders end up happening because we've suppressed something for so long. It might impact my eating, my sleeping, my weight loss or gain, which might impact body image issues and so on and so forth. And we don't realize how quickly it starts spiraling. So I guess that's what happens when we don't cope with it. And so it's very important to find ways of expression, whatever those expressions might be. It may not be talking, it might be through expressive art-based techniques, it might be through strengthening your support system, it might be reaching out to people you can trust, feeling and creating that emotional safety for yourself.
So often there is because you mentioned that sometimes we tend to isolate ourselves simply because we feel like, okay, we can't grieve this, or welcoming somebody else into our lives would induce a similar grief, let's say a couple of months later, if not today. So I feel like there's also this other element that crops up in my head, that's shame. And often we don't, I feel like we don't give due importance to that feeling because it's like, it's fine. But I feel like that can also impact how we are grieving or whether or not we are grieving.
Absolutely. I think shame is a very integral part, and a lot of times shame happens from me within, right? As an individual, I feel like I'm very weak. And we start using these words like, am I weak? But I used to be strong. What has happened to me? And with that judgment, there's so much shame that you're supposed to like move on, right? I've seen a lot of families at the hospital as well with my patients who are experiencing cancer. They say, oh, be positive, think positive. So the moment you feel I'm having a bad day, I feel that shame that I'm not being positive. So if I'm having a bad day, it's because I'm not positive today. It's important for us to also acknowledge pain. That's part of my resilience process. See, Tina, I think as people, we all are resilient people. We just don't know until we are dealt with something which is harsh as an experience. And until then, we keep saying that person is so strong because they've had so much grief and trauma and loss in their life, but look at them smiling. But I'm here crying because I've just had a breakup, for example, or I've just like changed cities, so now I'm just, sulking because I don't like the weather of the city. But look at them, they're so strong. That's how we start comparing. Sometimes even when it's not the society, it's these very deeply internalized, ingrained feelings that I'm supposed to be in a certain way, otherwise I'm grieving it all wrong. That person also had a breakup, but she's so happy, he's so happy, they are so happy, whatever. And we don't understand that sometimes being, in your words, strong can also be to say, you know what, this is my pain, I'm hurting today, and that's okay. I'll be better tomorrow, and I hope I'm better tomorrow, but if I'm not, I'm going to give myself that mental and physical break to deal with it. So the shame also has to be reduced by you and your ideas of how you are. You might have been a very happy-go-lucky person until this death hit you. You also didn't know that, right? It's an unexpected, unexplored territory. So you're also figuring out together. We all dealt with the pandemic. We didn't know, we weren't taught in school that, at one point we'll have a global pandemic to deal with and you'll have mental health changes as a result of that. But we all in our own little big ways tried to be here with a lot of privilege. I'm talking, obviously. There were a lot of hardships that people went through. But again, these are your own experiences that you shouldn't shame, no matter how different they look from, say, your experience as well.
I think that was pretty intense and also pretty insightful conversation. So taking away from Hiba's points that she shared with us today, I think we should stop shaming ourselves first before we move on to maybe becoming a support system for somebody else. I think it's important to often have conversations with ourselves and then understand if we are hurting today or I'm having a bad day, what is it about? I think sometimes we're so drowned in the noise of, like she pointed out, pop psychology as well, that we don't even want to sit down for 2 minutes with ourselves to figure out, okay, why am I feeling so sad today? So I think maybe you can start with that, if nothing else. And then obviously there's always the need that if you need it, you should go for the help. I have personally benefited a lot from taking therapy, from seeking help. And I would definitely say that I have been guilty on a lot of occasions of being very harsh and saying that I should be able to deal with it on my own. But I think therapy taught me to get over that and to tell myself that asking for help doesn't make you weak. And that's something I would really want to emphasize on, that asking for help for whatever it is does not make you weak. If anything, if you would like to hear it that way, I think it just makes you strong because you're able to ask, to do something about that. Thank you for watching this episode. If you have any feedback or suggestions about what kind of topics we should discuss, please feel free to drop in the comments. Also follow us on our social media handles. Thank you.